Baldur's Gate 3. It's one of the most important RPGs of all time, and personally, one of my favorites. And a big reason for that, more than any other, is the love and passion behind this project. A game where every action you take is radically realized and reacted to. Each system is deep, and all characters lovable in their own way. But behind all this greatness too lies a lot of mystery about the lore, history, and events in this story and world, or even the possibilities of what can happen in-game that so many players miss. So today, I wanted to take some time to deep dive into each and every insane or awesome theory, conspiracy, or fact about the game you guys will find fascinating. And to clarify, this isn't your usual Iceberg where we will simply go down some pre-made lists one by one and quickly touch on every topic. Rather, I've handpicked and custom selected only the best and most interesting facts, lore, and theories to show you guys today. So without further ado, here is my custom-made Baldur's Gate 3 Iceberg explained. If there's one moment in Baldur's Gate 3's history that assured us the game was going to be something special, it has to be the infamous bear scene. A video so wild, so unexpected, that it quite literally took a game from a beloved, albeit niche audience of CRPG lovers into the mainstream. You see, 1 month before the actual release of the title, during one of Larian's infamous Panel from Hell live streams, in an attempt to explain how varied and crazy their newest game could get, gameplay was shown of multiple romances between characters, but nothing could prepare anyone in the audience or anyone around the world watching for what would happen next. Live, in front of hundreds of thousands of victims, or viewers in this case, the druid companion Halsin and his vampire counterpart Astarion confessed their love for one another, and proceeded to remove multiple articles of clothing for what was obviously going to be a very raunchy scene. But in the most insane twist imaginable, as things began to heat up between the two fan favorites, Halsin, in a fit of passion, loses control, and transforms into a massive brown bear, after which he slowly trots his way towards Astarion with a mischievous smile on his face, and the scene fades to black. It was an extremely controversial reveal at the time, quite literally resulting in Larian Studios being banned on TikTok and multiple arguments breaking out as to whether or not it was even okay. But in the end, it paid off, as Larian got millions and millions of views and impressions all across the internet, and from this moment forward, the hype for the game reached heights it never would have even imagined before. But the thing is, as feral as this last-second marketing decision by Larian was, it's now an extremely well-known fact about the game's history that many players are well aware of. What a lot of these same players don't know, though, is that this scene might actually be our biggest indication of a much darker secret happening behind the scenes for our trusty druid Halsin. Because this fascination with bears from Larian may be more than just a funny meme, and our first clue about Halsin himself. You see, almost every wood elf we know about in the Forgotten Realms, the universe Baldur's Gate 3 takes place in, is known for their extremely skinny stature and frame. But somehow, by contrast, Halsin, who is apparently a wood elf himself, resembles more of a bodybuilder with a diet high in protein. So why exactly would this be? Maybe Halsin is simply stronger than most other people in his race. There certainly isn't anything stopping most wood elves from building more muscle, but as we dig deeper, things start to get a lot more insane. For example, we have this seemingly innocuous conversation between Karlach and Halsin about his past. Your oldest sin, right, Halsin? You must have a lot of good stories. A few, but people always warm to the most salacious chapters. They forget how much I study, meditate, and as a bear, hibernate. I must have spent 100 years or more asleep. What at first glance seems like any normal conversation between friends is in fact a huge clue if we look deeper. First of all, why does Halsin directly refer to himself as a bear? Sure, he's able to wild shape into different animals on a whim, but he literally calls himself a bear here, not an elf. Seems odd. And even more crazy is the reference to hibernation. And the reason this specifically is so important is that elves in the Forgotten Realms lore almost never sleep, rather opting to enter into a meditative state called reverie or trance, where they relax their bodies but remain aware of their surroundings. But here, Halsin seems to be saying he quite literally hibernated like a bear would, and for 100 years no less. We know too that druids do not partake in any hibernation or sleep patterns relating to their wild shapes, always reverting to their elvish ways no matter what form they take. So what the heck is going on here? Well, if you haven't caught it yet, it might just be that Halsin isn't an elf that transforms into a bear, but a bear that transforms into an elf. And we have a lot more compelling evidence to back up this theory too. At one point during Baldur's Gate 3's development, there was supposed to be a werewolf bard companion in our party, but it was cut for unknown reasons. And despite how awesome that sounds by itself, some in the community have speculated that Halsin actually took this companion's place, as we do know that originally Halsin was supposed to just be an NPC, but because he got so much love in early access, he was converted into a full companion. Maybe this werewolf bard's backstory was partially converted into Halsin's companion arc, and thus the idea of a literal bear masquerading as an elf was born. On top of this, when changing into a bear by using your wild shape spell as Halsin, his name literally changes, which is especially weird when we consider another druid in our party, Jaheira, who always keeps her name no matter the shape she transforms into. And even more damning, if you actually change Halsin's class in-game using withers to something entirely different than a druid, every single one of his druid spells and icons will disappear as you would expect, except for one. His class action, which allows him to transform into a bear. Or in other words, no matter what you do, Halsin can never get rid of his ability to become a bear. When you combine this with the fact that under high stress or very emotional moments like his romance or epilogue scenes, Halsin will automatically transform into a bear, it's heavily implied that there's a lot more than meets the eye with this jacked elf. And the more and more you look into this theory, the more, for me at least, it's all but practically confirmed. There are multiple strange dialogue lines about how good Halsin's smell is, small tidbits about his past that reveal he grew up around a spirit that could transform into animals, and if you get close enough with him, he will even tell the player character that a bear once tried to mate with him, which is how he originally got the scar on his face. So while we still have no definitive answers from Larian themselves, for me, it's all but confirmed that our lovable wood elf companion is actually a talking bear. And if you thought that was crazy, just wait for some of the other finds coming up on this list. One of the main things that makes Baldur's Gate 3 so special is how different one playthrough can be from the next. And a big reason for this is that many extremely rare things can occur only under very specific circumstances, resulting in new things to see on each and every playthrough. But in terms of things like this, far and away one of my favorites is Dinosaur Island. Right at the start of Act 3, as you make your way into Rivington, the southernmost district of Baldur's Gate, if you hang west you will discover the Circus of the Last Days, an eclectic extraplanar band of traveling performers who are led by the necromancer Lucretius. But while this circus has many strange and wacky things for you to find, maybe the single most insane out of all of them comes from a genie named Akabi. When you find him, he is running a special game where for a hefty price of 500 gold, you can spin a magical wheel that gives you a chance to win jackpot, allowing you to claim a special nearby treasure chest for yourself and your party. But as with all genies, there's more than meets the eye going on here. And if you investigate the nearby treasure chests for yourself, you can quickly discover that all that's inside of them is useless trash. Furthermore, no matter how many times you actually play this spirit's game, you will never land on jackpot, meaning the game has been rigged from the start to screw you out of as much money as possible. So for players that manage to restrain themselves from instantly fighting the deceiver upon this discovery, you can actually manage to pickpocket him when he is not looking with either a very high agility check pass or using a shrouding spell to hide yourself. In his inventory, he has a small ring simply called the Genie Ring, and if you put this on one of your characters and play his wheel game again, this time you will actually manage to land on jackpot. In a fit of rage, realizing what has happened, Akabi teleports the member of the party with the ring instantly into a completely unrecognizable area, a dense jungle unlike any other location in the game, and even more horrifyingly, one full of prehistoric predators dinosaurs. Back in Rivington, your other companions have no way of reaching you, so it's your job as whatever character has the ring on to either slowly creep your way around these strong foes or face them head on and slaughter everything in your path. Regardless though, however you decide to tackle this insane situation, there is actually some super awesome loot to find in this area as well, including the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel ring, which allows the wearer to cast illusion or enchantment spells as a bonus action after hitting a creature with a weapon attack, or much more notably, the legendary trident weapon, called Nirulna. This massive spear can be thrown by any character with the strength to hold it, and will immediately return to the user's hands after causing a massive thunder explosion wherever it lands. On top of this, it gives the wearer a huge bonus to move speed and jump distance, along with completely negating all fall damage, making it amongst the single most build-defining and fun-to-use weapons and pieces of equipment in the entire game. And more than anything, it's a perfect example of just how unbelievably deep Baldur's Gate 3 can get. This is a super intricate small questline that less than 1% of the player base will even see. Most players don't even know about the Genie Akabi, and many have never even been to the circus. And on top of that, there are even smaller and lesser known interactions here too. Like the fact that if you are a bard, you can actually fart in Akabi's face instead of doing the whole pickpocketing thing, and he will get pissed and teleport you regardless. All things that are off the beaten path are completely ridiculous, and yet are still home to astounding reveals like a new plane of existence full of dinosaurs or weapons that can completely change how you play the game. And you know, whenever anyone asks me why Baldur's Gate 3 is one of the greatest RPGs and just games ever made, despite the few problems it does have, I always point to things like this. Maybe the best part of Act 1 in Baldur's Gate 3 is actually a place you don't even have to technically go to, the Underdark. It's a sprawling underground cavern full of strange monsters, weird lore, glowing plant life, and lots of secrets to uncover. But one of the least well known of all of these is the Bual cult. Located to the east of the Arcane Tower and just below the beach area that takes you to Grimforge, you can find a small patch full of mushroom caps and dead bodies. But while there are tons of things to find here, including a secret fake wall that leads to a teleporter directly taking you to the Hag's Lair, even more hidden is a cracked rock in the very corner of the zone, in a spot that almost no one would think to look at naturally. If you manage to jump your way over to this small outcrop, you're able to climb your way down into a secret underground cavern called the Festering Cove, with a giant river running through it and even more notably, occult worship going on. A large group of degenerate and sadistic amphibian humanoids known as the Kuatoa can be found surrounding a small stage and chanting a strange hymn, all while sporting an ominous red glow on their hands and weapons. If you approach this unusual seance of sorts, out of the shadows a redcap appears covered in a dark bloody substance all over his body. Quickly, you realize that this redcap calls himself Bual and is being worshipped by the frog people around him like some sort of god. They see him as an avatar of Bane, god of murder, and they think he quite literally is their savior. And there are tons of options here you can use in dialogue that result in a myriad of outcomes, including a full-on murder hobo track where you can just take out everyone, or even the ability to sacrifice one of your companions, resulting in their permanent death in order to gain a permanent buff for one of your characters called Bual's Blessing. Luckily for us though, sacrificing one of your favorite companions isn't the only way to get this buff, as you are able to convince the frog people that their god is a lie, and then murder him in front of them, after which you can pick up his special weapon, the Sickle of Bual. The weapon provides the user with a 2d4 strength modifier for slashing damage, and also is infused with the might of formidable Bual's Blessing, which means the wielder gains advantage on attack rolls against bleeding creatures as long as there are Kuatoa still alive to worship the greatness of Bual. It's a really cool little side area that almost every player will miss on any of their playthroughs, and there are tons of hidden treasure chests and pieces of loot down here as well to discover if you're diligent. Meaning it's actually a great place to stop by if you need to upgrade your party a little bit. But the even crazier part about this entire encounter, that surprisingly I've seen no one online talking about yet, is the reason Larian even made it in the first place. You see, back during Baldur's Gate 3's original development, a small band of developers in the art department actually became involved in a local group in Ghent, Belgium, known as Tyrannic Amphibiotis. This cult of sorts, which began in Wyoming, is a small yet prophetic group of individuals who claim the entire world will soon be consumed by frog-like lizard people that live underground. Think Alex Jones on steroids and primarily now based in Europe. Nonetheless though, the Larian developers in this group not only came up with the entire idea of the Kuo-toa cult, but they modeled it after their own real-life experiences in the Tyrannic Amphibiotis, which up to that point was very secretive and unknown around the world. The real crazy part about all of this though came shortly after the game's initial release, when two of the Larian developers in this cult were arrested and swiftly removed from the studio due to their involvement in a cult sacrifice where some of the members kidnapped local school children and forced them to eat live frogs, after which they took out katanas and— no, I'm just messing with you guys about that last part. Sorry, I can't help myself. The strange ox from Baldur's Gate 3 is one of the most insane and weird things in the entire game, and the more you dig into it, the wilder it gets. You see, we meet this unusual beast for the first time at the Druid's Grove in Act 1, where if you're paying attention and have the ability to speak with animals, you can talk with a specific ox in the encampment acting especially strangely. Humorously, when speaking with him, he almost seems to mock you. But as you press further as to what is really going on here, he tells you he needs to get to the city of Baldur's Gate and that he can say no more. But as any of you who have found this peculiar little ox know, when speaking with him, you can't help but shake the feeling that something here is very wrong. And the further you get into the game, the more you see why. In Act 2, after arriving at Lamplight, you can walk your party over to the nearby barn, where once again the strange ox can be found, again hiding amongst the tiefling refugees as a humble and docile creature. This time though, if you manage to pass multiple speech checks with the creature and continue to press at him asking what he truly is, or if you're the Dark Urge as well, the strange ox will reveal visions to you of something truly horrid. Mangled bodies and corpses strewn across the floor, pushed together into a garbled mess of blood and guts, which contort into a soup that boils with rage and anger. Dead people all around you, with screams and pain at the apex of your very thought, and the thirst of torture dripping from your lips. As you pull away from this vision, it becomes even clearer that there is more to this strange ox than meets the eye. And in Act 3, on the outskirts of Rivington, we get even more clues. When talking to the ox here, if you decide to help him once again, he will instantly transform into a literal apple, after which you can pick him up and smuggle him into the city without anyone knowing. And then he will give you a shapeshifter's ring and a nice note, along with joining you in the final battle as an ally you can call upon in the upper city. Outside of this just being one of the most absurd quests in the entire game that lots of players miss, it also results in even more questions and answers. First and foremost being, what even is the strange ox? Well, what I didn't mention earlier is if you ever decide to attack the creature at any point during the hidden questline rather than helping it, it will actually transform into a massive slime monster that oozes toxins and can prove a quite formidable opponent. But that still doesn't explain what exactly is going on here. After all, what is the menacing, almost demon-like voice and insane rainbow colors on the slime's body? Well, it could be that this mysterious ox is none other than an ooblex. These ancient and extraordinarily intelligent and powerful oozes are known to be created by mind flayers in the Forgotten Realms lore. And considering mind flayers are at the center of the conflict in the main story, we already have a big connection. Even more interestingly, ooblexes have the ability to feed on the minds of their victims, literally stripping their memories from them and taking them as their own, learning their abilities and knowledge alike. From these stolen memories, the ooblexes can transform their bodies to match that of their host, thus taking on the form of anything they have overpowered and allowing them to quickly change from one look to another to trick adversaries. Due to their naturally high intelligence as well, they are known to mock opponents or play games with prey, and can be quite brutal, tearing adversaries limb from limb and piling the limbs into a soup of bloody death. Sound familiar? But maybe the biggest piece of evidence we have, the smoking gun if you will, is the actual name of this enemy itself. Strange Ox. Ooblex. Ox. The first and last letters of what this creature really is. And if this is the case, then the being we keep meeting all throughout the game might actually be a shape-shifting maniac that could literally be taking on the bodies of our friends or NPCs at different moments and acting like them to trick us, similar to, say, Orin. A scary thought, for sure. Any game of the size and with the amount of content of Baldur's Gate 3 is bound to have some bugs. But while quest-breaking or crash-heavy ones can be a big issue that ruins a first playthrough, in my opinion, most other bugs are just kind of funny and not a big deal. I've famously made tons of videos about how Cyberpunk 2077 was actually a masterpiece and that the bugs were just funny even on release. And it took years to get to the point where a lot of people actually agree with this now. But in the case of Baldur's Gate 3, there is one specific bug the game had early on that actually might have made the game even better: the Demon Exorcist. You see, on initial release, there was a strange, albeit hilarious issue in the codebase where sometimes different NPCs, while you were talking with them, would decide that normal human contortions and ways of speech were just no longer their style. Far and away the most common NPC with this affliction, though, was Raphael's gold dwarven agent of chaos, Corilla Hearthflame. For most players, you probably know her as the girl you can try and save during the Deal with the Devil questline during Act 3, one of the greatest, if not the greatest quests in all of Baldur's Gate 3. But for those that got to this act early on, like say myself who had a review copy for the game, often when speaking with Corilla, they would go full on psycho mode. For example, here's a clip of her walking away from the player after speaking with her, and as she does, she fully twists and contorts her body and eerily stares at you as she exits. It's a haunting scene for sure, and when you combine that with so many others where her head will turn around 180 degrees or her legs and arms will start to spin around wildly, you quickly realize why so many players were afraid of her on initial release. The thing is though, some in the community have begun to wonder if this so-called bug wasn't actually an intentional feature. After all, think about it. Corilla works for a literal devil, and at multiple points in Acts 1 and 2, you can see her in the distance spying on you, after which she swiftly disappears. Even though you can find out later that Raphael has tortured her sister endlessly, she still is a loyal servant to evil. So it could be that these strange body convulsions and contortions we saw on initial release are actually proof that Corilla is more than a dwarf that made a deal with the devil, but an actual otherworldly demonic creature instead that feasts on our fear and loathing. We probably never will get a real answer to this, and most people will write it off as one of many bugs the game had on initial release. But I don't know, something about that pair of brown eyes gives me pause, and makes me wonder what is really going on with this sinister demon that may even have the ability to patch out things so we can't find them. Or I'm just making shit up. Maybe the single most disappointing part about Baldur's Gate 3's initial release, outside of the horrible bugs in Act 3, was the ending. After spending hundreds of hours with these characters and this story, it felt like everything just ended so abruptly, and in such a lazy and boring fashion. It was a sour end to an otherwise fantastic package, and left a lot of people wanting more. But while we did eventually get that more, with hours of extra content added in the epilogue via a patch months later for free, that doesn't mean that some things won't forever be lost to time. And in the case of events towards the end of the game, none have gotten more traction than the cut content in the upper city of Baldur's Gate. As those of you who have played know, in the final hours of the main campaign, we do in fact get to play out some sequences in the upper city. But all of these are very on rails and mission based, simply taking us from one set piece to the next, with little room to truly explore and discover. Whereas the lower city and Rivington feel fleshed out and expansive, full of quests and NPCs to talk to, the upper city by contrast is barren and unexplorable. The thing is though, this may not have always been the case. Many data miners in the community during the initial months after release were able to find tons of files that indicated there was at one point many more plans for the upper city, including multiple buildings and multi-hour quest lines that would have taken us to some of the most prominent locations from the original games, along with potential extra content for companions like Karlach that fans thought was sorely needed. However, Larian has come out and addressed these rumors directly, stating that plans for the upper city were set in stone well before the release of the game, and that they did not intend to include any more content there. Still though, there's a handful of the community that still claim to this day that the Upper City and the now hundreds of discovered files of cut content for it would have been something truly special, and that Larian should have committed to doing even more. Personally though, I think Larian made enough already, with one of the largest and most deep games ever made. But it's still exciting to see some modders are making the dreams of the Upper City come to life, and maybe one day this forgotten part of the city, which is up in flames by the time we reach it, will finally get to see the light of day again after we first saw it decades ago in Baldur's Gate 1. It feels like every NPC, no matter how insignificant or small, has something special going on in Baldur's Gate 3. And Quelena, the level 2 female high elf wizard you can find outside the chapel at the very start of the game, is no different. As most of you are probably well aware, this chapel that is situated right next to where you crash land and wake up on the beach at the very beginning of the game is also the secret hiding place of withers, who can be found sealed away in the hidden dark crypt below the chapel. When you first arrive at this area above ground though, you will immediately notice that there is a group of bandits waiting outside trying to figure out a way to get some hidden treasure below. For the majority of players, you either talked your way past this petty gang or tried to fight them, in which case they all band together and will try to take you down. What almost no players know about though, is that if you actually use a spell or action to cut a rope holding a boulder above 2 of the bandits, they will immediately be killed. And furthermore, if you do this while invisible or hidden, Quelena, the third of the group, will come by the hole in the ground to check on them and then comment about how it's a good thing since she has to split the treasure with less people now, showing her true colors after all.
Well, there's one less greedy bastard to share the loot with.
Things start to get a little weird though if we decide to overanalyze exactly what she says. That's one less greedy bandit to share the loot with. At first glance, this seems to be in reference to the single bandit with her left standing who she would presumably share the loot with. But what if this was actually an allusion to someone else as well? You see, if you kill or pickpocket Quelena after this event, you can find a book on her body titled Talus, Divination Without Magic, which inside contains multiple volumes on different Talus cards and their meaning, which for those of you who don't know, are cards used in a popular game played all across the Forgotten Realms. Think say Gwent in The Witcher, or something analogous to playing chess with friends. On the title page of this book though, we can find a message pinned from a lover named Alis, who apparently has confessed his feelings for Quelena and wishes for her to let him know how she feels upon arriving back home from her mission. This is a cute, albeit tragic little bit of storytelling for those of you who might have just ended Quelena's life. But even more interestingly is the title of the book itself, Talus, Divination Without Magic. What exactly could this innocent phrase mean? We know that some inhabitants of Faerun, a major continent on planet Teril, which is one of many in the Forgotten Realms canon, do in fact use Talus cards for divination purposes, to influence the past, present, and most importantly, future. Could it be that Quelena is actually coming to the chapel in order to find Withers, a being who is seemingly of immeasurable power with the ability to cheat death itself? Maybe she saw a future in her cards that led her here, and if that's the case, could some nefarious force be behind it all? Maybe Alis is actually a demonic being, using code to instruct Quelena to go to this location and awaken a beast that would consume the world. And in fact, later on this list, the final theory I have will also tie this together and potentially give us a full reason as to what's going on here. So wait for that. But regardless, maybe she's also just a wizard at the wrong place at the wrong time. If there was ever a competition for the bestest and goodest boy in all of Baldur's Gate 3, then without a doubt, Scratch would sit atop the throne. As many of you probably already know, this poor yet lovable dog can be found in Act 1 just outside the Goblin Camp. When we encounter him, he is alone and afraid, walking in circles around a dead body by a tree. And if we inquire further, it quickly becomes apparent that Scratch has lost his owner, a courier named Gomwick who told Scratch to run as he was attacked and slaughtered by a band of hostile gnolls. It's a sad scene for sure, but if you pass some speech checks and dialogue, you can convince Scratch to smell you and get your scent, after which he will show up at your camp for the rest of the game. At camp, you can do things with Scratch like pet him, play fetch, or tell him he's a good boy. But what a lot of players don't know is all of the things Scratch is involved in, and the crazy reveal you can find in Act 3. First of all, if you ever throw Scratch's little red ball out in the world or combat, he will immediately appear ready to fetch. And in particularly difficult combat encounters, this can prove super useful, as Scratch actually has the ability to help up any downed party members to keep them in the fight. On top of this, once he has joined your party, he will fetch important items for you or bring things you have thrown back to you, including decapitated dead rats or severed arms. Another awesome interaction Scratch can have as well is with the owlbear cub. If you manage to take down the mother owlbear in the cave in Act 1 without slaughtering her little baby, you will again find the cub in a cage at the goblin camp. And this time, if you save the poor little creature, you can send them back to camp to hang with Scratch. And when you make your way back to camp after this, you can find both of them constantly playing with one another and running around everywhere. It's super cute, and if you have the ability to speak with animals, you can talk with them both about how great their life is and how strong their bond and friendship really has become. It's just another example of how wholesome Scratch and anyone who goes near him is. But the actual most surprising thing we learn about this good little boy who deserves some treats comes in Act 3. Because in Act 3, if you manage to find the Sword Coast couriers near the Rivington windmill, you can speak to some members that will inform you Scratch is actually their dog who has been lost for weeks. At first, many players would feel elated, proud to bring out Scratch to these people, expecting him to be happy to find his old owners. But when you do bring him, the exact opposite happens. Scratch is terrified, his tail tucked between his legs and ears lowered, as he simply looks at you with tears in his eyes, clearly in immense distress. Without even a second thought, you can easily deduce that the kennel master Maria was abusing Scratch as a puppy, and that for his whole life he has likely been starved and hit by this horrific monster. And as anyone who has played Baldur's Gate 3 knows, the most important rule to follow in any single playthrough is protect Scratch at all costs, which means yes, the proper response here is to gut everyone on sight. But regardless of what you decide to do, if you convince the kennel master to leave or kill her, Scratch will stay with you with a huge smile on his face, knowing that you truly do love and care about him. There technically also is an option as well to return Scratch to his evil master, now subject to a life of torture, but I refuse to believe a single human being on planet Earth has ever chosen this route, and I personally refuse to try it myself in-game to see the possible outcomes just for you guys. Sorry, every man has his principles. On top of this as well though, are other dogs being kept in cages, which you can actually save by speaking with the owner of the building who will release them into more caring hands. And well, it's a fitting in for a dog that deserves so much love and care. Even for those of you who have never played Baldur's Gate 3, you probably know a lot about the Druid's Grove and Goblin Camp from Act 1. And that's because there have been hundreds of videos all about the different things you can do to help either side all over YouTube and TikTok. Varying from turning the Druid's Grove against the Tieflings and causing a race war, systematically picking off goblin leaders one by one from the shadows, or even lining up mile-long trails of explosive barrels and setting them all off at once, killing everyone. But there's one smaller interaction, so rare that I am confident almost none of you have ever actually experienced it yourself. You see, if you side with the Grove during your time in Act 1, you will be tasked with saving their leader Halsin and taking out each of the goblin leaders so that the goblins themselves become unorganized and disperse. It turns out to be a pretty foolproof plan if executed correctly, and results in both the druids and tieflings amicably parting ways and surviving into future acts where they once again will need your help. But for almost any player that goes this route, you will likely bring your entire party to the goblin camp to fight the leaders when the time comes. After all, why would you not? There's no reason to leave one person back at the druid camp while the rest fight the goblins. However, if for whatever reason you do this, you are met with one of the rarest and least well-known cutscenes in the entire game. Within moments of killing the third goblin leader, you will immediately be pulled away to your companion or companions sitting back at the Druid's Grove, talking with a mysterious NPC that we have never seen before named Gerson the Bent. Gerson excitedly exclaims that scouts nearby have reported that the goblins have been neutralized, and that the way is now clear for everyone to walk to Baldur's Gate. But hold up, How on earth could this mysterious man know anything about this? He claims that scouts have made the reports, but considering that we quite literally just killed the final goblin leader mere milliseconds ago, it doesn't make any logical sense that this could happen. So why does this man actually know this then? And even more horrifying, who is this man? You can spend hours combing through every single inch of the Druid Grove before, after, and during your fight with the goblins, and you will never find any sign of Gerson either existing or being talked about or written about by anyone close by or far away for that matter. He has no history, no backstory, no friends, no family, no quest, and absolutely not a single reference to him in the entire game outside of this very short and very rare cutscene. And while it seems clear that he is simply nothing more than a backup NPC, that's supposed to make the transition from the Grove from its usual state to that of leaving makes sense for players that do leave any companions in the Grove as the goblins fall, but even then, if that's the case, why not just have someone like Zevlar tell you this? He already knows everyone in the party, you've talked to him multiple times and helped him out, and it would just make the most sense for someone like him to let you know this, considering he's usually the first person you speak to on your return to the Grove on normal playthroughs. So could it be that there really is something more sinister and crazy going on here? We are talking about a person that has never been seen before with absolutely no one else aware of his presence. A man who through some sort of omnipotence knows when something has happened miles away the second it happens, and a tiefling who is sporting suspiciously large horns. Maybe, just maybe, there is more going on here than meets the eye. Potentially Gerson is actually Raphael in disguise, or another being entirely watching over us on our journeys with some nefarious goal in mind. Either way though, I think something more is going on with Gerson the Bent. After all, even his name, the Bent, is a common slang term used to describe people who are liars and hiding something often evil. Maybe our true enemy the entire time was not the Emperor or Elderbrain, but one tiefling with an especially good mustache. In pretty much any game I play, one of my favorite builds to go if possible is the Summoner. There's just something about creating an army of underlings to do everything for you and sitting back while they fight that makes my inner capitalist smile. And because of that, one of my favorite interactions in all of Baldur's Gate 3 comes from Sovereign Glut, a rather plump myconid who you can find deep in the Underdark in their colony. Glut has a special spell called Animating Spores, which allows you to reanimate any monstrosity type creature you have slain as a spore servant that follows your every command and will fight to the bitter end in battle. This means you can choose from a whole assortment of different creatures to come to your aid, even including the fearsome Boulette, which burrows underground in the region and is very tough to kill if you aren't prepared. On top of this too, Glut himself has a pretty cool questline to hunt down some Dwergar, and you can even work with him to backstab the colony he is a part of to gain more power for yourself or tell him to bugger off. Regardless though, far and away the part everyone remembers about Glut is this spell. But what a lot of players don't know is how much it actually works on. You can raise harpies, gnolls, cats, wargs, ettercaps, and even the mighty minotaurs. But far and away the least well-known thing you can reanimate, and maybe the coolest, are the mimic chests. If you manage to spot one of these on your journeys later in the game, say in Act 2 or 3, and slay it, if any of your characters have extremely high strength stats and an empty inventory, they can actually pick up the entire dead body and hold it. If you then take the body of the chest with you back to the Underdark and to Glut, you can reanimate the body, and boom, you suddenly have a massive chest following you around with a gargantuan tongue it can use to slap people. It's one of the coolest interactions in the whole game, albeit one of the most ridiculous, and goes to show why systematic first game design is so important. I mentioned it in my original Baldur's Gate 3 review on release and also in my Every RPG Ever ranked video, but what I personally think makes Baldur's Gate so special in the first place is it's essentially an immersive sim, where systematic designs and approaches to how the game is played lead to interactions like the undead mimic chest, where things that sound amazing on paper but usually aren't possible in other games suddenly are commonplace in an RPG epic like Baldur's Gate 3. I mentioned earlier on this list how the Speak with the Dead spell in Baldur's Gate 3 has some of the coolest interactions out there. And in terms of this, another we have to touch on comes from a big moment in Act 3. Gortash, one of the 3 leaders of the enigmatic cult of the Absolute, and chosen of Bane himself, god of tyranny and lord of darkness, is a man on the verge of becoming the Archduke of the city of Baldur's Gate, and as such, would wield immense power to do evil. So as you would expect, most players at some point through a myriad of means will find a way to kill Gortash, eventually resulting in the player character and companions standing over his lifeless body, full of joy knowing the citizens of the city are that much closer to being safe. But you see, there's actually a very strange interaction here that a lot of players don't know about. You would expect to be able to cast Speak with the Dead on such an important individual, and when you do, you would also expect to hear him speak. But in the case of Gortash, you are met with a different, much more sinister voice, that of Bane.
And so it is for you. You make me eternal.
He laughs and quickly informs you that Gortash is now his, and will forever be tortured for his failings. But if you press further, you can actually learn more about Bane and his plans as well. For example, when asking about why Bane allied himself with Ball and Merkel, he explains that only by making them allies did he guarantee they were not foes, implying some deeper meanings behind their entire alliance. And overall, I just thought it was a really cool interaction that I had no idea was in the game, and it makes you wonder what other bodies might be out there we still need to speak to learn more. I think we can all agree that after Baldur's Gate 3, pretty much anything Larian Studios works on next will have the world watching. But luckily for us, while we sit and wait for the inevitable announcement of what this coming game will be, we might be able to get some hints from Baldur's Gate 3 itself. For those of you who don't know, Larian Studios has a history of adding little Easter eggs for their next game in each previous one, and there is one specific book that might be our best guess for the next big Larian IP. Called Therapeutics, this small novel found in the House of Healing in Act 2 contains excerpts from an oneromancer who has seen a vision of something truly spectacular. In the Forgotten Realms, oneromancers are individuals with the ability to interpret dreams and use them to form magics. And in this volume, we read about an individual who consumes a strange hallucinogenic, which sends them into an outrageous and otherworldly dream, which they then paint out on a canvas in front of them as it happens. These drawings in the novel are described as the following: weird lumbering shapes sailing over cities, metal windmills attached to their sides, and here, oblongs fitted with wheels tearing locomotives across a track, and here, a mechanized person waving directly at the viewer. Immediately, this doesn't resemble anything we can readily find in the Forgotten Realms setting, because despite some areas in the canon lore going through an industrial revolution of sorts, nothing comes close to the flying blimp-like machines described here. In fact, something like that sounds more akin to a steampunk setting like, say, Arcanum or Clockwork Revolution than anything in fantasy. And well, that might be because this could be Larian's big hint at what their next game will be. And personally, I think that sounds amazing. I've always been a bigger fan of sci-fi than fantasy, but if I'm being honest, it's so seldom that science fiction is actually pulled off well in games. But if anyone can do it, it's Larian. And a big budget steampunk or sci-fi RPG with immersive sim design approaches pretty much sounds like my ideal dream game, and probably a lot of your guys's too. There are some other theories about what their next game could be as well, including Divinity Original Sin 3, due to books we can find in the game that give reference to Tarkin, a mad scientist from Divinity Original Sin 2 who gave us hints about Baldur's Gate 3 in that game. But truthfully, I really hope that isn't the case. As someone that personally loves Divinity Original Sin 2, I just think a science fiction setting would be so much more interesting, and also allow Larian to flex their creative muscles a bit more. But nonetheless, whatever the next game does turn out to be, I will be there day one to support and play whatever this studio has been working on for years, ready to form my own opinions on whatever they turn out to be. One of the biggest draws for many Baldur's Gate 3 players is the companions and their voluptuous romances. But for me, if I'm being honest, the companions and how unrelentingly horny they are is actually one of my biggest criticisms of the game. It feels like no matter what you do, every companion is down at all times, and they start to feel less like people and more like objectified sex dolls because of it. Regardless though, some of the companion quests and romances still have some really awesome moments, taking us to new places with varied cutscenes we wouldn't see otherwise, and giving us more background on the people we talk to constantly back at camp. However, there is one romance scene, with Karlach specifically, that has an interaction most of the community has no idea about. Early on in Act 3, you get a chance to take Karlach out on your guys' first date, and the venue of choice is none other than the Singing Lute, a local bar and restaurant located in the lower city that is preceded over by Tender Hank, a slender half-orc with a lovable smile. But the thing is, as with all quests or interactions in Baldur's Gate, because of the freedom you are given at all times, you can actually kill Hank before this moment even happens. All across the game, Larian provides contingency plans for cases like this, substituting one NPC for another or changing how things play out. But in the case of this date with Karlach, should you kill Hank, there, as far as you know, is no one else to fill the spot. That is until you actually get to the date itself though, where another, suspiciously similar looking half-orc named Honk steps in. The interaction and dialogue plays out exactly the same as before, with the only difference being Karlach saying a different name. It's one of the least well-known interactions in the entire act, and almost no players will ever actually see this, but some in the community have begun to wonder if a lot more than meets the eye is going on here. First of all, Hank and Honk both have almost identical face models in-game, with the same teeth, nose, and eyes. And on top of this, on Hank's body, if you do kill him, you can find a note from Honk asking him to read it. But if you actually read the note, which simply states, "Do loot in kitchen when closed," it almost sounds more like a code phrase than an actual letter. Could it be that Honk and Hank are actually the same person? Or maybe even clones of the same half-orc, an experiment of sorts being conducted by a mad scientist hidden in Baldur's Gate, who behind the scenes is running the Singing Lute and replacing any of its killed henchmen with a clone of one unlucky half-orc? Honestly, probably not, and this is likely just Hank's brother who's taken his place while he's gone. But considering that this NPC didn't even exist in the wiki for months after release, and for a long time was considered a folktale, maybe there is a lot more going on here than we originally thought. And potentially, years from now, the truth behind this clone army could be revealed. One of the hardest parts about making a sequel to a beloved and old series is bringing back well-known characters and making them work. And in the case of Baldur's Gate 3, there are tons of returning cast members to take a look at, spread between companions, quest givers, and maybe most prominently of all, the literal antagonist of the first game, Servok Onchev. This chaotic evil human deathbringer is a Ball spawn, a mortal child sired by the god of murder Ball, who in the original games tries to become the literal reincarnation of Ball himself by murdering all those who stand in his path. He's a fan favorite character for a reason, and even a decade after starring in his first game, essays are being written about what made him great. But you see, as would be expected, bringing this legend back for a cameo in Act 3 of Baldur's Gate 3 was bound to leave some in the community with a sour taste in their mouth. And that's because the Servok we see in Baldur's Gate 3 for a lot of people just doesn't feel quite right. The original Servok in the old games was a spawn of Ball, and while in many ways he did serve Ball's teachings, he was still his own character, with his own desires for power and desires outside of serving his father. But in Baldur's Gate 3, this version of Servok seems to serve Ball in a much more religious manner. And this is only more unnerving if you count the fact that in the Throne of Ball DLC for Baldur's Gate 2, you can actually redeem Servok and bring him back to the light, stripping away his devotion to the god of murder entirely. So this then begs the question, what is going on with Servok in Baldur's Gate 3 then? Well, some especially observant community members noticed that early on in Baldur's Gate 3, you can find a book titled Disorders of the Nerves and Mind, a treatise which details the ramblings of a man who apparently found a book which convinced him he was actually Servok. The book somehow, without the use of magic, was able to literally convince random people that they are the Lord of Murder's own destined spawn. And even more hauntingly, based on some of the passages, it's heavily implied that these scriptures could be written by devout Ballists who might be trying to lead more people to join the cause. Could it be that in an attempt to bring back favor to their god of murder, these Ballists created books that would give rise to someone who would see themselves as Servok himself and take his place to help push the Ballist agenda forward? It's a pretty far-fetched idea, especially when we consider companions like Jaheira can talk to this Servok in-game for some time and don't mention any red flags, as well as the fact that playing as the Dark Urge means you will get custom dialogue with Ball that imply this is the real Servok. But potentially, somehow, some way, this man we come into contact to in Baldur's Gate 3 is not the real one we met so many years ago. And that might explain why something about him just isn't the same, and he isn't reacting to things that happened before. Because after all, it's hard to pull any characters like this off so many years after their first conceptualization. If given a choice to pick one main leader of the Cult of the Absolute from Baldur's Gate 3, most people would probably go for Ketheric Thorm. And that's because Ketheric really embodies the feel of a villain. He's gregarious, brooding, and heroic in his own evil way, trying to avenge the death of his beloved daughter. And throughout all of Act 2, he serves as the clear antagonist, who is leading a literal army that will soon descend onto Baldur's Gate and take the city, and on top of this, he has immortality on his side as well. It all comes together to make him a pretty terrifying and interesting villain. And because of that, when you get to Act 3 and find no one even close in stature, it can feel kind of weird or off-putting. But what if I told you that out of the Dead Threes chosen, the leaders of the Cult of the Absolute, Gortash is far and away the real leader behind everything? And that essentially, the other two don't matter at all. First of all, if you actually study the three cult leaders, that being Ketheric, Gortash, and Orin, Gortash seems like the only one genuinely doing anything. While Ketheric is serving as a puppet leader to lead a fake invasion on Baldur's Gate, and Orin is out murdering people on the streets to cause chaos, Gortash is always behind the scenes plotting the next move. After all, the Cult of the Absolute's end goal is to cause chaos in the city, after which Lord Gortash can ascend to the throne and command an army of thralls under the Elder Brain, after which the Dead Three can move on to take over the rest of the world. But to even do this in the first place, the Dead Three had to come up with a way to gain followers, true souls. And well, Gortash is the person who went through all the trouble to even make True Souls a reality in the first place, by commanding the power of the Illithid tadpoles to mind control individuals. On top of this, Gortash is the creator of the Steel Watch, massive mechanical soldiers who patrol the city of Baldur's Gate, who were made through combining of Mind Flare and Infernal technology, which he likely garnered by signing a pact with the Archdevil Zariel and handing over Karlach. So in essence, Gortash is not only the creator of True Souls, the entire basis of the Cult of the Absolute's army and power, but he also created the Steel Watch, the entire second hand of their military force. And that's not even to mention the fact that to do all of this, presumably Gortash was arranging agreements and pacts with multiple interplanar demons and beings alike. And before any of this even happened, he worked his way through the ranks of Baldur's Gate elites to become a lord himself, where he had to keep face and hide his true intentions every step of the way. Or in other words, pretty much every event in the main story, each encampment you encounter, every person, race, or monster you find has in some way been touched by this man. And if you play as the Dark Urge, when you first meet Gortash, you will find out that you also used to be buddies, and he was planning with you years ago and knew everything would happen well before it did. There's no two ways about it. Envir Gortash is a genius. Evil, but a genius. And without him, there simply is no Cult of the Absolute, there is no Dead Three, no reascension of the gods of tyranny, murder, and death. In a way, he serves as the guiding force behind everything bad that has happened in-game. And it's surprising too, because for a lot of players, myself included, he felt like kind of a letdown in Act 3 initially. For such a powerful and influential man, he could have been used in much more interesting ways. But maybe that's because the true most powerful and evil being, the one pulling the strings behind everything the entire time, even one step ahead of Gortash himself, is something we will touch on here shortly. Few companions in Baldur's Gate 3 command the same level of fandom as Astarion, and for our next section, we need to talk about a scene with him that everyone missed. This high elf vampire spawn rogue with the charlatan background is found originally to the west of the crashed Nautiloid ship in Act 1, and from the moment you find him, Astarion proves to be quite the handful. He's witty, mischievous, and daring, but most of all, is characterized by a horrific past, where he lived under the sadistic rule of a vampire lord named Cazador Zar, and was forced to engage in sexual acts with thousands of people in the city of Baldur's Gate, all to lure them to his master's lair and create more vampire spawn. For years and years, Astarion was tortured, abused, and neglected in the dungeons under the city, and as such now wants to kill the man who ruined his life. There's a whole questline here even involving the opportunity to allow Astarion to ascend and become an evil vampiric lord himself, with tons of different cutscenes that can play out or options to choose from. But much earlier in Act 3, there is actually one event that can happen that leads to an entire cutscene and moment that most people don't even know about. While resting in the city, you will be awakened in the dead of night by a band of vampire spawn that are looking to take Astarion back into captivity. The fight itself is hilariously easy, as the 3 spawn have almost no health, no attack damage, and are literally some of the weakest enemies you can fight in the entire game, Act 1 included. So for that reason, pretty much no one actually lets Astarion get caught here. It's basically impossible without intentionally letting it happen. But if you do, you get some really deep insight into Astarion's past. After he gets captured, your player character will remark that it's pointless hunting vampires at night and that your team will head out to find him tomorrow, after which you go to bed. And during this sleep, you get a cutscene with Astarion now deep underground in an unknown dungeon, being awoken by an evil skeleton named Godi, who is a servant of Master Cazador. Godi laughs about how Astarion has finally come back to him, and that he would be torturing him endlessly for his transgressions, but Cazador needs his blood, and thus he must behave. You can briefly talk and taunt Godi, but no matter what, after a short while, you have to make a saving throw to protect yourself from Godi keeping you captive. No matter what you roll here though, Astarion's tadpole will come in to save him, and you will break free from Godi's grasp into an immediate fight, after which you will need to sneak your way out or have the team come and save you. It's a really interesting scene that gives more flavor to the backstory of Astarion, and it's even more crazy to think that almost no players will ever actually see this, considering it's basically impossible to land yourself here without being asleep at the wheel for the fight before, or if you intentionally hate Astarion and want to get rid of him. But if that was the case, you probably already handed him over to the vampire hunter in Act 1 or disposed of him in any other manner of ways long before Act 3. So for that reason, it's one of the most well-hidden cutscenes in the entire game that actually has a lot going on that it teaches us about Astarion. And it makes you wonder, what else might there be in Baldur's Gate 3 that no one else has stumbled upon? Entire cutscenes and fights that happen under the weirdest of circumstances. Maybe one of the single most interesting spells in Baldur's Gate 3, a game full of so many, is Speak with the Dead. It allows any user to pull the life force from a nearby corpse, forcing it to answer 5 of your questions that you get to choose from freely. Throughout the game, this results in many moments where you can solve quests or learn backstory and lore by simply talking to any dead body you can learn more from. And on top of this, depending on the character, the corpse might refuse to speak to you as well. For example, some recently slain adversaries will refuse to converse with their killer, forcing you to don a disguise in order to get what you want out of them. So this means all over the game are lesser known encounters that involve using this spell, but maybe the single most insane out of all of them comes from Urgir. This Orthon, also known as a Rage Devil, is a demon hunter that has found themselves in a contract with Raphael, and as such, they are both looking to kill one another. Raphael tasks you with hunting this elusive beast in its own lair deep inside the Gauntlet of Shar, where you can find the Night Song in Act 2. And if you go to the very eastern side of this gargantuan underground temple, you can eventually find him. And when you do, either choose to side with him, fight him outright, or if you're a bard, talk him into taking out his allies, followed by himself. It's a really cool encounter that has a lot of ways to tackle it, but it's what happens after that really makes you shudder. Because nearby his base of operations, you can find none other than Urgir's bed, a hulking fortress of meat and decay, full of the rotting bodies of Shar worshippers who have been slain, stitched together into a mound of flesh. It's a horrifying scene at first for sure, but this only gets more so when you realize that you can use Speak with the Dead on the bed. And when you do, the agonizing moans of these people can be heard as they explain to you what happened and what their lives were like, as you look into the faces and eyes of the bodies still intact enough to make out pure pain in their expression. And really, it's just one of those insane encounters that you wouldn't expect to be in the game at all, but somehow is. It's personally something I never knew about until doing research for this video, and it shows just how morbid the world of Baldur's Gate 3 can really get, and how it does things that literally no other game in history has even attempted to. Nothing drives a man more to the brink of insanity than love. And in the case of giant purple squid tentacle monsters called Mind Flayers from Baldur's Gate 3, this rule most likely carries over as well. Because you see, for as annoying, manipulative, and uncomfortably flirty as the Emperor is in-game, this Illithid may have quite the heart as well, and behind his evil persona could be a tragic tale for a woman he has used, but also lost. For those of you who haven't experienced it yet, later in Act 3, after the Emperor starts to reveal his plans to you and how he is using you, you learn that at one point he was pseudo-controlling the city of Baldur's Gate by mind-controlling a powerful woman named Belynne Stellmain. As one of the previous members of the Council of Four, the governing body of the city appointed for life from around the 14th to 15th century in the game's canon, Stellmain held great power and responsibility over decision-making for the city's future. But sadly, near the end of her life, she began to experience massive strokes that wiped her mind clean and led to her eventual death in the front of the city. It's strongly implied, and all but confirmed as you will see shortly, that these strokes came at the hands of the Emperor and his mind control. But as to why he would do this, players have been wondering since the initial release of the game. And that's because in-game, we can actually find this very peculiar journal passage titled Patient Log, Duke Stellmain in the Emperor's Hideout. Presumably written by a nurse caring for her during the seizures that eventually took her life, part of the passage reads the following. Duke used to receive visitors in private every 10 day, always hooded and cloaked, always shown in and left to attend Duke privately. No luck in finding. Oddly enough, can't recall visitor's gender or even stature. Could be half-orc or halfling for all I know. Hoping for their return, visits appear to ease the Duke's mind and body greatly. When we combine this with the fact that the Duke was constantly asking to see this strange visitor, and the obvious allusions to this hooded figure being the Emperor himself, things start to get really weird. After all, if the Emperor was the one responsible for Stellmain's death, why on earth is he coming to visit her again after, and why is she finding so much solace in him? The whole exchange just doesn't make any sense, but due to a long-form post on Reddit from user Not So Happy Not So Sad, we may just have an answer. You see, while it's widely known that Stellmain was part of the Council of Four, which we already touched on, what a lot of players might not know is that she also is a leading member of the Splinter faction group known as the Knights of the Shield. This secret society of information brokers and political manipulators were unbeknownst to the public in service to an archdevil turned deity known as Gargoth, a manifestation of evil incarnate also called the Hidden Lord. In the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition campaign Descent into Avernus, we learn that the Hidden Lord uses his powers of manipulation by having people speak to him through a divine shield hidden away in the city. And in this campaign, we also learn that at one point, a nameless NPC stole the shield from the Hidden Lord in the Huan Crypt and stashed it somewhere. And what would you know, in Baldur's Gate 3 and the Elfsong Tavern's Knights of the Shield headquarters, where Stellmain and the Emperor had rooms and constantly met, you can find a hidden room with a small knight shield and paraphernalia, and most importantly, Stellmain's journal on a counter. So this all heavily implies that Stellmain was directly involved with the Hidden Lord, likely doing his bidding for some time, and it's for the most part been speculated that this was because the devil was using Stellmain before she met the Emperor, and that when the Emperor comes onto the scene, he takes control away. But what if it were actually the other way around? In the Huni Mausoleum, we can find small diary entries from Stellmain that presumably talk about her first encounters with the Emperor. And as we can see from these, along with random notes found in the guild hall of discussions between patrons in the Elfsong Tavern, Stellmain really liked the Emperor at first, and by this point didn't seem to be fully under the effects of mind control. This idea is further accentuated by the fact that the Emperor talks about her so fondly in his memories he gives to us in-game. But considering he's a master manipulator, we can't take these at face value. What does provide a lot more evidence, though, is that if we secretly break into the Emperor's room, on his desk is a picture of Stellmain, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt she must mean something to him. But once again, if this is the case, why did the Emperor kill Stellmain? From all the evidence we're looking at thus far, it seems as if the Emperor has the biggest case of multiple personality disorder of all time, constantly oscillating between loving and caring for Stelmane and casting her aside for his own gain like cattle. Well, could it be that the key thing we are missing is how the Hidden Lord is involved? Rather than being an entity that Stelmane met before the Emperor, what if they met after? I mean, think about it. How did Stelmane even get into the position on the council and in the Knightly Order in the first place? Sure, she could have worked her way up the ranks, but to be such a crucial member in both organizations with no compelling lore on her abilities beforehand in childhood seems pretty far-fetched. What makes this entire series of events not far-fetched, though, is if you have an ultra-intelligent and manipulative mind flayer hidden in the shadows helping you along the way. So could it be that the Emperor and Stelmane actually met when she was nothing but a young, attractive woman? A woman that the Emperor sought not only to use as a tool, but also a woman that he fell in love with. They could have continued to help one another ascend the ranks of the city of Baldur's Gate, until one day, while they tried to uncover the secrets of the Knights of the Shield in the secret room we find, Stelmane was contacted by the Hidden Lord, who through his immense power was able to twist the minds of both Stelmane and the Emperor against one another, causing the Emperor to subjugate Stelmane to seizures that took her life. Considering they are both not necessarily good people to begin with, lying and corrupting their way to the top, a devil's influence taking hold would be commonplace. At some point during this portion of history, where the Emperor is slowly killing Stelmane, the event we learn about from Descent into Avernus happens, where the shield is stolen from the Hidden Lord and he loses power. This could have caused the spell over the Emperor to lose effect, after which he would have felt intense grief for what he has done, constantly visiting Stelmane on her deathbed and consoling her, which perfectly explains the passages we referred to earlier. So as far as I'm concerned, this is the story of Stelmane and the Emperor. And while it doesn't make either of them a hero by any means, it adds some much needed humanity to especially the Emperor, who was once before a human, Balduran, the man who literally founded Baldur's Gate. It means he likely fell in love with this woman chasing his own dreams, and then one day found himself awakening from a nightmare, only to see his own lover dying in his hands. No wonder he's such a dick in-game. In terms of places in Baldur's Gate 3 with lots of mysteries and secrets, maybe none are better than Sorcerer's Sundries from Act 3. This large, colorful, and circular building located in the southeast of the lower city of Baldur's Gate serves as the breeding ground of magic, where denizens looking to buy infused weapons, armor, wands, potions, or spell scrolls can come and spend to their heart's desire. It's a magical place, no pun intended, and as you would expect from any arcane buildings like this, there are lots of hidden things to find. Above, you can make your way to Ramesses Tower, where you can find Lorkhan and multiple portals to faraway places. But there actually is something the exact opposite way that might be even more interesting. Because hidden below Sorcerer's Sundries is a large string of vaults, which contain and protect some of the most powerful artifacts, books, and spells in the entire game. To even get down here in the first place, you will need to solve a puzzle in the main building, involving turning invisible or sneaking around and pulling on books that are actually levers, or unleashing hidden portals, lockpicking, and walking through fake walls. On top of this, once you actually find your way inside the vaults, you will be met with a labyrinthian room of pure confusion, where you will simply open one door after another, endlessly walking into oblivion and heinous traps. However, there is one door, the Elminster door, which if you can get through, leads to a secret most players have never seen. To get to this door in the first place, you will need to go through the Silverhand, Evocation, and Wish doors in that order, while surviving multiple traps or illusions your party will need to avoid. After getting through the Elminster door, you are then greeted with multiple pieces of loot, including the Tharchiot Codex and another copy of the Necromancy of Thay, which you can find in Act 1. But there actually is even more hidden reward here as well. Behind the vault's main portal, past a hidden path beyond the stone walls that can be opened by pressing a small button hidden to the right, you can find another hidden room and hallway. And while most players will continue down this to find more treasure, if you yet again find another hidden wall before the main room, you will be taken to another secret spot, this time much older than all the others. In this room is nothing but a peculiar altar sporting an unassuming lamp that can be found. And without even going further, most players will probably start to be on edge and worried at this point, because pretty obviously something is going on here. If you do interact with the lamp though against your intuitions, suddenly a genie will appear before you and teleport you inside the lamp. The area is exuberant and covered in silk tapestries, bedding and pillows, along with striking colors of purple and gold. And on top of this, there are tons of rare weapons and scrolls or potions to find here, hidden away behind bookshelves or silk linings. But the true horror reveals itself quickly, as the genie informs you that only one soul may be inside this lamp at once, and that he has been sitting alone here in this hell for years. As quickly as you met him, the genie leaves you, now alone and stuck forever inside this tomb, endlessly wasting away your days in fine Italian-like furnishings. It's a horrifying revelation for sure, and if you don't know what you're doing, it can spell huge trouble. Because just as the genie told you, only one soul is allowed in this lamp at a time, and that soul may never escape. For many players, this results in searching around the zone frantically for a way out. And if you didn't teleport into the lamp already with ample spell scrolls or slots, you might be in big trouble. Luckily though, for players that didn't come prepared, hidden away in one of the corners of the main room, you can find a scroll of Summon Quasit, which allows you to summon this poor demon to forever be trapped alone and afraid in the lamp, thus taking your place and letting you escape. It's a sad or happy ending depending on how bad you need your main character or companion back with all the loot they found. And it once again goes to show just how deep this game really is. Almost no players will actually find this lamp, hidden behind a handful of invisible walls, trapdoors, guards, or puzzles to solve. But yet if you do, you are met with one of the coolest and most unique interactions in the entire game. So much effort into something that practically no one will ever find. And really, that's what makes Baldur's Gate 3 so special. The lamp is just one of these that I never personally found on my playthroughs and wanted to show you guys, but there's so many just like this that really make every single playthrough such a cool experience. As we've already touched on, the Emperor is one of the most important characters in all of Baldur's Gate 3. He's the masked crusader who was in your head the entire game under the guise of the Guardian, and depending on how you see him, is either friend or foe. But one thing most players can agree on is that something about him just feels off. It's like he was written into the story in the final hour and acts more like a plot device to turn you against the Netherbrain rather than an actually deep character that was planned from the beginning. And well, that's because as far as we can tell, that's exactly what happened. You see, what a lot of players don't know is that near the start of early access, years before the game actually came out, but still while players were able to play through most of Act 1, the Guardian and scenes you have with them in your dreams were much different. At this point in development, the Guardian, referred to as Daisy, was not the Emperor or Balduran in disguise, a fanatical mind flayer looking to accomplish their own goals. Instead, the being you were talking to was actually the tadpole itself. In each and every scene, you were slowly convinced by this slimy worm to stay with it in this idyllic meadow in your dreams, to sit by the beautiful man or woman that was nothing but a figment of your imagination. In fact, this was such a central part of the narrative of the game originally that the songs Down by the River and The Power, which are still in the game and constantly play, if you listen, are about Daisy, about a tadpole trying to convince you to fall asleep forever as Ceramorphosis takes over your body and consumes you. The narrative at this point during development would have centered a lot more around the potential downfall of your mind, where you constantly would have been in struggle against the tadpole to transform you. In fact, there was originally an ending to the game written where you were able to succumb to this tadpole specifically and transform into a mind flayer with no agency, and the campaign would simply end. And really more than anything, it's just fascinating to know that the Guardian we speak to in-game wasn't always the Emperor, and by extension, the story must have played out a lot differently. To be honest, the Emperor's inclusion, while not my personal favorite in the story, especially some of the things he does like flirting with you, which makes the narrative beats lose a lot of weight, I do think that at the end of the day, he serves his ultimate purpose, which based on his action in game seems to be a plot device to move things forward in Act 3, so you have more options and someone to tell you what to do. But part of me misses what we never got to. I actually remember very early on trying Baldur's Gate 3 in early access briefly, and talking with what at the time was Daisy, and I think something like that would have not only made the Guardian as a character and sequence more interesting, but would have made the stakes of the game as a player that much higher, where you actually had to manage not turning into a mind flayer via seramorphosis throughout the entire playthrough, instead of it being a mechanic that doesn't actually matter at all. Nonetheless though, while Daisy is now a character we will never get to see, she is still one that lives on in our hearts. Baldur's Gate 3 is a game full of strange, weird, or wacky cutscenes, dialogue choices, and characters. Things that most players will never actually find, or when they do, will be in awe at what is happening. I've already touched on so many of these in this video, but there is one specific scene we haven't talked about yet that is unlike anything else in the game and might be the single most haunting experience in the series. A moment so peculiar, so horrific, that it will send shivers down your spine and still is shrouded in mystery as to what's even going on. One of fans' favorite companions breaks the fourth wall. You see, months after Baldur's Gate 3's original release, YouTuber Chublot noticed a very strange interaction that could happen in-game when searching through and messing with the file system. When using a specific set of console commands to allow archived files to be used, you can trigger a cutscene with Karlach that calls literally everything into question. Starting like any normal conversation with this lovable Zariel tiefling barbarian, Karlach mentions that while spending time in Avernus, she learned from some of the Archdevil ruler Zariel's clerics the ability to discern whether the person she was speaking to was telling the truth, a sort of magic trick. But if you allow her to use this so-called trick on you, suddenly things take a very strange turn. Karlach looks directly into the camera, not at the player character, but at you, and the camera pans close to her face. An ominous feeling begins to take hold as Karlach asks, "What's happening here?" And as you poke and prod more, asking Karlach what she's even doing, she starts to dive into questions about the grand design, destiny, love, and the bounds of reality and existence itself. Suddenly, out of nowhere, she inquires if this is your first time playing the game, if you know her, love her. And as your heart begins to beat faster and faster, with a creepy smile on her face, Karlach asks you the final question. Are you having fun?
You're having fun, aren't you?
If you answer yes, she seems pleased and happy, and just as quickly as the moment began, it ends, and the Karlach we know and love seems to come back to her senses, unaware of what just happened. It's far and away the creepiest scene in the entire game, where one second you think you're having a normal conversation with a companion, and the next you are contemplating the meaning of life while staring into the lifeless eyes of a video game character that is curious about your real life as a human being. The thing is though, most players will never actually see this scene. As I mentioned before, it currently can only be triggered with console commands or by sifting through the downloaded files in-game yourself. But nonetheless, this discovery has led some in the community on a search to see if this scene can be triggered in the base game as well. After all the voice lines, dialogue, character animations, and writing is there. It's a fully fleshed out and finished scene, we just don't know how to trigger it. So the even bigger question then is, why is this even here in the first place? This isn't some creepypasta or accident that is simply a note left by the developers. This is a full-on scene that would have had to have gone through multiple groups at Larian in order to become this polished in the first place. Well, our first clue is in the files we can find in the scene for the game. Inside some of the raw JSON data in strings, we can find a how to trigger flag, which has a value that literally says, currently cannot be triggered. To be discussed with Sarah what to do on this branch. For those of you who don't know, this Sarah being referred to in the data is most likely none other than Sarah Bayless, the writer at Larian who was in charge of Karlach, and if we take it at face value, this most likely means this branch of code was meant to be checked out of production, but somehow got left in, either by accident or on purpose. But the bigger question for me still is why? Why is this even something that was made at all? Was it just a bit of fun the Larian developers were having, a fun Easter egg that was going to be included but was decided against? Or could it be that there really is something very sinister and otherworldly happening with Karlach? And could it point to an even bigger conspiracy in all of Baldur's Gate 3 about a fantasy world that not only reacts to what we do, but to us as living, breathing people as well? And what could this commentary all mean? Especially considering many players online claim to actually have triggered this event in the base game with no mods or console commands at all. It's a fascinating, albeit somewhat terrifying find, and is so rare that for months players in the community thought the entire thing was a hoax and fake. But I still think that somewhere out there, the real Karlach, the one that knows she is trapped inside a video game, is having an existential crisis in need of our help. Lenore Dehurst might be one of the most interesting characters in Baldur's Gate 3, despite the fact that we never actually get to see her. And that's because the story of Lenore and the questions of what happened to her have been on my mind ever since my first playthrough of the game. And even over a year later, this mystery still lingers on, with a lot of potentially big ramifications to the series as a whole. For those of you who don't know, Lenore was a devoted cleric of Mystra who for years lived in the arcane tower of the Underdark, researching the magical properties of the harsh and mysterious underground, as well as interacting with things like susur flowers on the daily to record magical experiments. The exact specifics of why she was in this tower still remain unknown, and some in the community even speculate that there may have been some sort of top secret mission that was being developed. But as far as we're aware, it was just Lenore's passion to understand the Underdark as a powerful arcane user. Where things start to get weird though is the disappearance of this woman, and how no one knows where she's gone. You see, originally during her stay at the Arcane Tower, Lenore was aided by her beloved partner, Ur, a gnomish inventor and tinkerer who actually is credited as the creator of multiple items we can use in-game, like the Water Sparkers, Lifebringer, Blast Pendant, and Jolt Shooter. But at some point, the two lovers had a falling out, and this resulted in Ur leaving the tower to pursue his dreams of studying lightning and storm magic, while Lenore stayed behind and fell into a deep depression, writing poetry daily, all of which we can find in the tower while we explore, as well as building Bernard, a construct guardian infused with magic that defends the arcane tower and can prove to be a difficult fight for any of you who tried to best him at the peak of the tower when you met. In-game, you can actually even trick Bernard into thinking you're Lenore using passcodes. But regardless, it's clear from not only Bernard and other defenses and all of the volumes of text we can find in the Arcane Tower libraries that after Ur left, things took a turn for the worst. We also know that during this time, Lenore's pet dog Myrna, her only friend at the time, died, and she created a grave for the puppy nearby, which we can find in-game by the Dread Hollow. While digging this grave for her puppy, we can also find clues that Lenore befriended and became enamored with a boulette that kept going nearby the gravesite, which we can also find in-game when we arrive years later, still alive and aggressively defending the dog's tomb. The real tragedy though comes after this, when Lenore received an invitation to join a magic convention at the city of Baldur's Gate, after which she wrote a note and left it in the Arcane Tower for Ur, which told him how much she loved him and asked him to wait for her to return if he did find it. And just as expected, Ur did return and find the note, but after waiting year after year without Lenore ever returning, he eventually gave up and Lenore was never seen again. This has led many in the community to wonder what exactly happened to Lenore. We do know that the experiments going on in the Arcane Tower likely involve more than we even know, but we see no actual indications that anyone wanted to harm Lenore at all. And on top of this, Lenore left behind lots of valuables she would have been very attached to, like the ring, the Sparks Wall, and the hidden basement, which likely means she most definitely intended to make her way back to the Arcane Tower at some point. And the way she left things on the ground or even her bed implies heavily that she assumed she would be back very quickly as well. One theory during early access actually speculated that Lenore may have been eaten by the boulette, as during early access when slaying the beast, if you searched its body, you could find a slippery chain shirt, implying that the boulette ate someone, which in this instance would most likely be Lenore, who does have similar armor in the Arcane Tower for herself. However, Larian removed this piece of clothing from the boulette's inventory on full release of the game, and considering everything else we read about the boulette and Lenore is very friendly, it seems like a boulette's sacrifice or accident was not Larian's intention for Lenore. More compelling evidence can be found in Act 3 though, where in the vaults below Ramesses Tower in the lower city, we can find a small note written by Lenore addressed to the wizard Lorcan, which states that she has been visited by a strange extraplanar individual, potentially Tarkin from Divinity Original Sin 2, who gave her a view into the universe, hinting that Lenore may have actually followed him into other dimensions. This heavily implies that Lenore is traveling through time and space into other dimensions entirely and has left the Forgotten Realms, leaving her lover and blessed Arcane Tower forever vacant. But for me, this sequence of events opens up even more questions than answers. For example, what was this strange extraplanar individual's fascination with Lenore in the first place? Could it have to do with the research she was doing at the Arcane Tower? We know in the tower itself that there are secret rooms and multiple traps along with Bernard and an entire force of defense constructs. So this all implies that something is going on here that we don't quite have all the puzzle pieces to. And personally, I find this really fascinating because on my original playthrough of Baldur's Gate 3, I always felt like the Arcane Tower was missing something. It felt like this place was more important or impactful outside of just some environmental storytelling you can piece together. And I think Lenore's strange disappearance proves that very much is the case. Other theories in the community have come up with ideas like the fact that Lenore may actually be Omelum, the friendly mind flayer you can find in the Underdark who is studying fungi, or even that Lenore never existed in the first place. But either way, I have a funny feeling that Lenore, just like Tarkin from Divinity Original Sin 2, who apparently travels through multiple times and dimensions, may just have a funny way of finding their way into showing up in Larian's next game and giving us more clues as to what's really going on. And if I had to harbor some sort of guess, it would be that the Arcane Tower and the research Lenore was doing is into a multiverse or extra-dimensional portal to other realms that can link all past and future Larian games. Out of all of the returning characters we see in Baldur's Gate 3, whether that be Jaheira, Minsk, Sarevok, or Volo, for me, none are as awesome as this adorable little hamster, Boo. But you see, behind those cute and lovable eyes might lie a secret that throws the entire narrative of not only Baldur's Gate 3, but the whole series on its head. A theory that shows the most powerful and important forces in the universe sometimes come in a small package. But what exactly about Boo am I talking about? Well, first of all, for those of you unaware, a normal hamster's lifespan is around 2 to 3 years. And the reason this is important is that the main story of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, where we first see Boo, takes place over a period of a couple of months to a year, and by the time we find Minsk, he has already been acquainted with Boo for some time. Meaning Boo is likely a year or older by the end of Baldur's Gate 2, and even in the most charitable case, at least 6 months old, likely over a quarter of the way through their life. The really intriguing part though comes when you realize Baldur's Gate 3 takes place 100 years after the second game, meaning Boo should most certainly be dead by this point. The thing is though, as I'm sure many of you are thinking, both Boo and Minx were petrified at some point after the second game and have sat in stone for around 100 years. But even in this case, it would have been a couple of years after Baldur's Gate 2 that this even happened. So what gives? How on earth is this little hamster still alive after roaming for what must have been at least 5 years with Minx? Well, the answer might come from Minx himself, and it has some horrifying revelations. In both Baldur's Gate 1, 2, and 3, Minx will oftentimes remark about how Boo is no ordinary hamster, but actually a miniature giant space alien. This interdimensional breed of gargantuan hamsters that teleport through space are actually a real thing in the Forgotten Realms, and we can even see in the Githyanki creche in Baldur's Gate 3 some of their meat in the pockets of slain Githyanki. The thing about these hamsters though, is that not only can they talk and communicate with other creatures, sporting an impressive intelligence, they also live up to 18 years. So could it be that Minx's claims about Boo are actually true? It would certainly explain all the weird oddities surrounding the character, including how Minx talks about Boo talking to him when no one is around or commanding him in his sleep. Potentially, Boo could even be a top-secret emissary of sorts for some great power, a space hamster of diminutive size combined with supernatural reflexes and grand intelligence which he uses to control his barbaric host, Minsk. Maybe throughout multiple games, Boo has actually been pulling the strings behind the scenes. After all, isn't it a strange coincidence that Minx winds up as a companion involved in such big events seemingly every time they happen? Maybe that's because he is actually being mind controlled by Boo. a top secret hamster agent that is feeding intel back to his master, or even ruling the galaxy himself, slowly unraveling plots to his favor in multiple games. It perfectly explains why in each game, Minsk is able to narrowly survive so many things that should otherwise kill him, like lethal blows or crucial spell casts that always randomly fizzle out when they get near him at key moments in the story. The reason Minsk has survived is because Boo is always one step ahead. In fact, it could be that the petrification they both underwent was a next level step by Boo to get closer to the Tav and his party or the Dark Urge in Baldur's Gate 3 in order to enact his unknown next steps. For those of you who play with Minsk in your party, you will recall multiple times he talks about Boo knowing an ambush was coming or predicting the future. And the more you look into it, the more it looks less like the ramblings of an idiot warrior, and instead a poor innocent man being used as a pawn in an evil space hamster's ultimate plan to take over the world for some nefarious unknown force. Or Boo is just a cute little hamster. That's always possible too. But either way, it's crazy to think that some of the strongest and least well-known powers and forces in the universe of the Forgotten Realms might be hiding under our noses as cute little companions the whole time. As the son of Mephistopheles, the archdevil ruler of Khania, 8th layer of the 9 hells in the world of the Forgotten Realms, which we play in Baldur's Gate 3, you would expect Raphael to be quite the conniving and evil devil. And well, he is. But what a lot of players don't realize is just how horrifyingly competent this Cambion may be, setting forth many of the events in the story of Baldur's Gate and enacting a plan so grand that the end of Baldur's Gate 3 might just be the beginning. You see, for those of you unaware, in Baldur's Gate 3, one of the central story points revolves around the Crown of Karsus. This ancient artifact constructed by an arch-wizard of the fallen magical empire of Netheril was used by a young Netherese mage named Karsus, who sought to return his empire to their former glory by stealing the divinity of the goddess of magic, Mistral, the same deity who later was reborn as Mistra, Gale's lover in-game. But by stealing Mistral's divinity, the weave of magic defending the mortal world became unstable, and the floating cities of Netheril fell from the sky, and the great civilization was lost to the sands of time. During this period of chaos, Raphael's father, Mephistopheles, obtained the crown of Karsus for himself, and hid it away in one of his many vaults of great power within the realms of hell. For Raphael, though, he sought to use this crown for his own ambition, to subjugate all 9 layers of hell under his eternal rule so that they would work together to conquer the multiverse. And despite how much this plan proves Raphael's hubris, that doesn't mean he isn't also patient. After all, simply walking into the vault to steal the crown under his father's nose would most likely result in his eternal torment. And trying to get other extraplanar beings to help him might result in backstabbing or the plan being revealed. So Raphael had to turn to other measures, the mortal realm. We know that at the end of Baldur's Gate 3, Raphael proposes a deal of sorts. He will give us the Orphic Hammer to release Orpheus, who can defeat the Emperor and Netherbrain only if we promise to give him the crown of Karsus in return. If we accept, this works out perfectly for Raphael. But the key here is how we even got to this point in the first place, Raphael's grand plan. We know that the crown of Karsus was originally in Mephistopheles' possession, but was stolen by the Dead Three under the planning of Gortash and used to control the Netherbrain under Moonrise Towers. But how did the Dead Three pull off a feat such as this? Could it be with a little shadowy help from a Cambion known as Raphael, with a very clear reason to let them have it? By ceding the crown to the Dead Three, Raphael knew he would not only be able to trick his father and antagonists, but also your party into rising to save the day, needing the Orphic Hammer in the final hour to win, thus giving Raphael control of the crown while circumventing his father and adversaries entirely, and now having a weapon of pure mind control. We know too that Raphael was making up contingency plans as well, as we can see when we catch him talking with and leading Mole all throughout the game, likely in a bid to turn her into an evil servant of sorts that can steal the crown if need be, just like she stole the idol from the Druids in Act 1. And it all goes to show that Raphael really does live up to his birthright. showing that he is a devil that thinks one step ahead, just like his father. And it also makes me wonder about the role of Mole and Arabella, as we will see in this next section, for potential sequels to Baldur's Gate 3. Because as grand as the conspiracy of the Dead Three and Elder Brain turning everyone into Mind Flayers is, there are other players at work here like Raphael, who in the shadows are pulling the strings more than we ever knew, and might be the key to where the Forgotten Realms lore is going next. However, only time will tell. While I've already touched on so many strange characters or NPCs in Baldur's Gate 3, none of them come close to the intrigue behind our next guest, Withers. This skeleton man with a dry sense of humor is known by most players as the guy at camp that lets me respect. And I don't blame them. Withers constantly speaks in riddles, says nonsensical things, and tends to regard the player as if they were totally irrelevant and meaningless when compared to the grandiose corpse standing before them. But what if I told you there was a reason for this? And that with Withers, there is a lot more than meets the eye, and the zombified shell of death at our camp might actually be the most powerful force we come into contact with throughout the entire game, with a plan so great it could affect all of Faerun. To prove this point though, we need to discuss who Withers really is, a topic many in the community have already proven and talked about endlessly, but let's go over it here so we're all on the same page. First of all, we initially find Withers in the crypt just outside our crash zone in Act 1, hidden underground in a temple of sorts dedicated to the god of death, Jurgle. We know this because inside the temple is a large statue which, if you pass a religion check, is identified as that of Jurgle, an ancient and mysterious figure. And even more so, scattered all around the entire area are libraries full of text in ancient tongues and riddles, all of which also point to Jurgle and his now long gone followers. As to how this ties to Withers though, our first clue is actually on his tombstone, which has a plaque that reads, "Here lies the Guardian of Tombs." For those of you who don't know, in Forgotten Realms lore, this is one of the main titles of Jurgle himself. And even more convincingly, when Withers steps out of the sarcophagus, if you try to damage him, you literally can't. And on top of that, he has infinite health. This isn't just a random skeleton you're dealing with, it's something much more powerful. Something like, say, a god of death, Jurgle. But just this on its own doesn't quite prove it. For that, we need a little more in-game evidence too. For example, when speaking to Withers in camp as a paladin, if you pass a D20 skill check, you will pick up on the fact that he actually contains a divine aspect, which are only held by powerful extraplanar beings like deities, primordials, and demon lords. And if you weren't already convinced, not only is there a post-credit scene and Dark Urge one where Withers all but confirms he is Jurgle firsthand, but in the in-game files themselves, he is referred to as Jurgle, not Withers, in many blocks of code. So without a shadow of a doubt, Withers is in fact a Jurgle. It really isn't all that hidden when you look at the evidence in-game, of which there's a whole extra hour's worth I could go over, but hopefully I gave you some of the most convincing to prove my point. Because the more fascinating question then becomes, what on earth is Jurgle of all people doing in our campaign, and what's his end goal? Well, before we get to that, some of you might still be wondering, who exactly is Jurgle anyways, and why does it matter if Withers is actually him? In the Forgotten Realms canon, Jurgle is depicted as a member of an ancient alien race that resembles a cross between a human and praying mantis, that has taken on the form of a mummified corpse. Sound familiar? But more interestingly, Jurgle also has a direct attachment to the Dead Three, the main antagonists along with the Elder Brain and Emperor of Baldur's Gate 3. And that's because many eons ago, after presiding over reality as the Lord of the End of Everything, Jurgle grew bored of his powers. Older than even most of the greater gods of Faerun, he was an alien being that simply did not want power anymore. After all, what else is there to do once you have become the literal herald of the cycle of life? So in order to break free from the chains he saw himself in, and after they asked, he bestowed his powers upon each of the gods of the Dead Three so that he could finally sleep and not worry about his powers any longer. In the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, which is a region sourcebook made by Wizards of the Coast that gives a lot of background lore on the Forgotten Realms, we can find this passage, which is a direct quote from Jurgle himself to the Dead Three during this transition. "The throne is yours. I have grown weary of this empty power. Take it if you wish. I promise to serve and guide you as your seneschal until you grow comfortable with the position. Who among you shall rule?" So each of the Dead Three was given an aspect of Jurgel's divinity. For Bane, it was his strife and tyranny. For Merkel, death. And for Ball, murder. And with these newfound powers, Jurgel served as a seneschal, one of the greatest of all time, only behind Abelard from Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. Regardless though, Jurgel shepherded in a new era of powerful gods who are the catalyst for everything happening in each of the Baldur's Gate games so far. So it's clear that Jurgel himself has a very direct and important tie-in to the events of Baldur's Gate 3, literally birthing the very people we're up against. But as you're probably now asking yourself, why is he helping us then? Well, remember how Jurgel is the lord of the end of everything? What that really means is that it's Jurgel's job to make sure the cycle of souls going from life to death continues on. After all, it's those very souls that power the gods themselves. For example, in those books we find in the crypt in Act 1, you can see NPCs' names and gods etched next to one another, record keeping for the scribe of death Jurgel to know where each goes. The reason he is awoken and is helping your party against the Dead Three is that they're breaking this cycle. By using a controlled elder brain to subjugate all living creatures to slavery via seramorphosis into illithids, the Dead Three are also stripping away the souls of these creatures as it is consumed by the tadpoles. But why would they do this? After all, Ball, Merkel, and Bane are gods themselves. To turn everyone illithid would mean they too are stripped of their godly powers. Well, as we briefly mentioned earlier on this list, if you cast the Speak with the Dead spell on Gortash after you've killed him, you speak with Bane. And if you ask Bane why they are doing this, he gives us a definitive answer, saying that sometimes the best way to win is not to gain power for yourself, but rather to strip your enemies of theirs. This strongly implies that the real plan of the Dead Three is to turn all of Faerun into illithid mind flayers that they have control over, thus stripping all gods in existence of their fuel, their engine. In this vacuum of power, as far as I can tell, there would be nothing but mortals. But 3 of those mortals would have an entire army of mind flayers at their beck and call. A world where the Dead Three can rule without answer, with no equals to challenge them. The reason Withers, Jurgel, helps us is that he cannot let this happen. The cycle he has bound himself to protect, even after releasing his powers to others, must be maintained. Withers knows that in their hubris, the Dead Three are willing to cast aside the very thing that makes them special in the first place, and he is back to once again right the wrongs of the world. And it makes one specific scene with Withers after you meet him originally so much more poignant, where when asking him why he is here to help, he simply replies, "Be assured it is not by choice." Because Withers does not have a choice. As the lord of all things that end, he must make sure they continue doing so. But we aren't quite done yet, because there is one more line, the very first in fact you hear from Withers, that might imply an even more crazy conclusion. You see, when Withers first steps out of his crypt all the way back in Act 1, he greets the player and companions by saying, "So he has spoken, and so thou standest before me, right as always." Who exactly is this he who has spoken? We know Withers is Jurgel, and we know Jurgel is an all-powerful deity who controls the literal cycle of death. So what kind of power would a being like this answer to? Because based on this single line alone, Withers has been commanded not of his own volition, but by something else. Not only does this recontextualize the previous quote we went over, the "be assured it is not by choice" one, but it implies that there are even greater forces at work that we are currently unaware of. Forces so powerful, so horrifying, that they make alien god deities who can't be killed bow before them. And you know, throughout our time with Withers, we see him sometimes leave to do things he never speaks about, or help characters like Arabella, who by the end of the game, we can find in a dark cave surrounded by bodies and blood, saying they are searching for something after getting close to Withers. Potentially, everything Withers says, does, and implies is nothing but a red herring, a shadow to mask the true intentions of a being behind him who is pulling the strings like a puppet master. And considering just how powerful Withers is, the thought of something even greater cannot be ignored. But considering Larian have said they will not be making another Baldur's Gate game, we may never get to see what that potential being is and was. And as Withers would have wanted, that brings us to the end of the Iceberg, and maybe the last Baldur's Gate Larian Iceberg I will ever do. But yeah, those are my favorite theories and facts that I either found or came up with for all of Baldur's Gate 3. And as I've mentioned multiple times throughout this video, the fact that there are so many awesome theories and ideas around this game, and that a video like this is only scratching the surface, shows exactly why this title is so beloved. So let me know down below what your guys' favorite theories or little known facts about the game are, and what you hope Larian can do in their next title to make it even better, or what you think about some of the things I've discussed here are. I'd love to hear your theories and ideas as well. Because I put a ton of work and effort into these videos every weekend when I have free time off my main job as a software engineer, and to see all the support you guys give, it really means a lot. Thank you all so much. I appreciate the likes, the shares, the comments, or anyone who joins the membership programs. It all goes a really long way to helping me do what I do here. I really do appreciate the support, and as always, I'll see you next time.